The black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima offered no comfort, only a gritty alien landscape under a sliver of moon. Lieutenant Jack Corrigan held his breath, the cold water of the Pacific seeping into the cuffs of his thin gear. Just inches from his face, a spiderweb of wires connected a horned mine to a concrete pylon, a creation of pure malice designed by a Japanese commander who was learning their tactics. A flare suddenly burst overhead, casting the entire surf zone in a terrifying, ghostly white light. Frozen in place, Jack saw dozens of Japanese soldiers on the beach turning their heads, their rifles beginning to rise. His hand, holding a block of C4 explosive, trembled. He had mere seconds to finish the job, but they were caught, exposed, and about to be annihilated. The invasion and thousands of lives depended on what he did in the next 5 seconds. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The briefing room aboard the USS Galloway was a cramped, suffocating box of steel. The air, thick enough to chew, was a foul cocktail of cigarette smoke, sweat, and the dregs of stale coffee that had been simmering for hours. On a corkboard, grainy aerial reconnaissance photos were pinned next to blueprints, their stark lines and shadowy shapes depicting the beaches of Saipan. A stern-faced intelligence officer, his pointer stick tapping with grim finality, drew their attention to the images. He spoke in a clipped, dispassionate tone that did little to soften the lethality of his subject. "These," he said, the stick landing on a blurry photograph of the surf zone, are what the Japanese call horned scullies. They are naval mines, welded to steel rails and driven into the coral. Touch one of those horns, and you'll vaporize a landing craft and every man in it. He moved the pointer. Here, concrete pyramids wrapped in barbed wire, designed to snag and shred the hulls, and between them, entire fields of anti-boat mines, sown like a farmer's seeds. Lieutenant Jack Corrigan stared at the photos, his mind already deconstructing the defenses. He was a man in his late 20s, a former civil engineer from Boston who felt more at home with stress calculations and material tolerances than with the raw, unpredictable nature of combat. The weight of command sat heavily on his shoulders, a physical pressure in his chest. He saw the beach not as a place of sand and water, but as an equation, a complex and deadly problem set he was expected to solve. The officer continued, his voice a low drone against the hum of the ship. A conventional naval bombardment won't clear these obstacles. The angle is too shallow. The landing craft of the first wave will be torn to shreds before they even get their ramps down. That, gentlemen, is where you come in." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the dozen young men packed into the room. Their faces were a study in contrasts, a mixture of forced bravado and naked anxiety. "Your mission is to swim in at night, under the cover of darkness. You will map these defenses precisely and then clear a 500-yard channel for the initial assault wave of Marines. The official designation is reconnaissance and demolition." Beside Jack, Petty Officer Finn O'Connell, a wiry, fast-talking sailor from Chicago with a reckless grin permanently etched on his face, leaned in and whispered, his voice barely audible over the drone of the ventilation. "Sounds more like suicide in a funeral, Lieutenant." Jack didn't respond, his focus locked on the corkboard. He could see the variables, the unpredictable elements that could turn his careful calculations into a bloodbath. Currents, unseen patrols, the simple, damnable factor of pure, dumb luck. "Gentlemen," the intelligence officer concluded, his voice dropping for emphasis, "your job is to make sure our boys don't die before they even hit the sand. You'll be the first ones in. No support, no backup. You are ghosts." The word hung in the smoky air, defining them. Ghosts. Unseen, unheard, and, if they failed, utterly forgotten. A knot of responsibility tightened in Jack's stomach. It felt like swallowing ice. It's a math problem, he told himself, his mind retreating to the familiar comfort of logic. A deadly, unforgiving math problem. Calculate the charges, the placement, the timing. But the variables are currents and patrols and the pounding of your own heart in your ears. Later, in the team's quarters, the forced confidence of the briefing room had evaporated, replaced by a somber, reflective quiet. The air smelled of oil and rubber, a clean, metallic scent that clung to their gear. The only sounds were the rhythmic scrape of a knife on a whetstone, the soft rustle of men writing letters home, and the constant low vibration of the ship's engines, a reminder of their inexorable journey toward the dark horizon. Men who had been joking and boasting an hour before were now lost in their own thoughts, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of the overhead lights. Jack walked through the compartment, his presence a steadying, quiet force. He was not a natural motivator, not one for rousing speeches, but his calm demeanor offered its own form of reassurance. He paused by each man, offering a quiet word, a nod, a simple gesture that said, "I'm here with you." He found Finn sitting on his bunk, away from the others, polishing a small, tarnished silver locket with the sleeve of his shirt. The cocky, fast-talking persona was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that few ever saw. He looked up as Jack approached, his usual grin absent. "You think they know we're coming, Lieutenant?" Finn asked, his voice low. "The Japs?" Jack sat on the edge of the opposite bunk, the springs groaning under his weight. He considered the question, looking at the faces of his men, so young, so full of a life they were about to risk for a few hundred yards of sand. "They know we're coming," Jack said, his voice equally quiet. "The Marines, the battleships, the whole damn fleet. But they don't know about us. They can't imagine anyone would be crazy enough to swim right into their front yard." A flicker of the old Finn returned. He snapped the locket shut and tucked it into his pocket. "Good," he said, a grin spreading across his face, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'd hate to ruin the surprise." Jack gave a slight nod and moved on, his mind drifting back to his life before the war. He had designed bridges, structures of steel and concrete meant to connect people, to endure for 100 years. He took pride in their permanence, in their utility. Now, he designed explosions, bursts of controlled violence meant to last a fraction of a second, with the lives of his men as the price of a single miscalculation. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He was an architect of creation, now tasked with mastering the art of destruction. The metallic scrape of the knife on the whetstone seemed to grow louder, each stroke a countdown to the moment when his abstract calculations would meet the brutal, unforgiving reality of the sea. The deck of the USS Galloway was a world of shadows and whispers. Miles off the coast of Saipan, the ship was a blacked-out behemoth against a moonless, overcast sky. The only light came from the dim red battle lanterns, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the gentle roll of the ship. The distant silhouette of the island was a dark, menacing shape on the horizon, a place that existed more in their minds than as a physical landmark. It was a fortress waiting to be breached. The team gathered near the railing, their faces and hands blackened with burnt cork, transforming them into spectral figures in the crimson gloom. They were armed only with K-bar knives strapped to their legs and the explosive charges they carried in heavy canvas bags slung over their shoulders. They checked each other's gear, the primitive fins and masks, with a focused intensity, their movements economical and precise. The air was cool, carrying the salty spray of the Pacific, but the tension was a palpable heat that radiated from the small group. For many, this was their first real mission, the terrifying culmination of months of grueling training. Jack moved among them, his voice low and steady as he gave the final briefing. He didn't need to raise it. Every man was straining to hear, to catch every last detail. He went over the plan one more time, his finger tracing invisible lines in the air. "We go in pairs," he murmured, his eyes meeting those of each man. "Finn and I are lead. We swim the first 100 yards, get a feel for the current and the layout. We map. No charges until we have a clear picture. Signal is 3 tugs on the guide rope for contact, 5 for emergency. We place the charges, link the fuses, and we get out. No heroes. We do the job, and we come home. Understood?" A chorus of low, affirmative grunts was his answer. He saw the fear in their eyes, but beneath it, a hard glint of determination. They were ready. The rubber rafts, their transport for the first leg of the journey, were lowered over the side, bobbing like dark leaves on the black churning water. The men began to board, sharing last handshakes and grim nods. The bravado was gone, replaced by a shared, silent understanding of what lay ahead. Jack was the last one to board his raft. As he swung his leg over the side, he paused and looked back at the massive steel wall of the galloway. It was a symbol of safety, of power, of the world he was leaving behind. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Finn, already in the raft, looking up at him. "Time to go for a swim, Lieutenant," Finn said, his voice tight. Jack nodded and settled into the raft. He gave the signal. With a soft splash, the lines were released, and the rafts were pulled away from the ship by the silent strokes of paddles. As the immense shape of the galloway receded into the darkness, a profound sense of isolation washed over Jack. He was no longer an engineer, no longer just a lieutenant. He was a ghost, heading into the unknown, into the heart of the enemy's domain, with nothing but his wits, his courage, and the dozen men who had placed their lives in his hands. The only sound was the rhythmic dip of the paddles in the water, each stroke carrying them closer to the shores of Saipan and the deadly, unforgiving math problem that awaited them in the dark. The water was deceptively warm, a silken cloak in the oppressive darkness, but the current was a living thing, a powerful, invisible muscle pulling them sideways along the reef. Jack and Finn swam as a pair, their movements synchronized from months of training, their fins beating a steady, silent rhythm. They were the tip of the spear, the first to encounter the obstacles that had looked like mere specks on the reconnaissance photos. Up close, they were monstrous. Horned scullies rose from the coral like the skeletal remains of leviathans, their steel forms draped in seaweed and slime. Concrete pyramids, larger than a man, stood in jagged rows, their surfaces rough and menacing. The sheer scale of it was designed to inspire terror, an underwater forest of death. They worked with a painstaking precision that bordered on surgical. Jack would approach a structure, his hands tracing its form in the dark, feeling for the best placement. Finn, carrying the canvas satchel of explosives, would hand him a block of C4, its putty-like consistency reassuringly familiar. Jack's fingers, already growing numb from the prolonged immersion, would carefully mold the charge against a steel beam or a concrete piling, then secure it with wire. Every shadow was a potential patrol boat. Every splash of a distant fish sounded like an alarm bell ringing in the deep. Their own ragged breathing, amplified by the confines of their masks, was a constant, roaring companion. The work was slow, agonizing. They moved from obstacle to obstacle, a silent, deadly ballet in the surf. They were joined by the other pairs, spreading out to form a line, each team responsible for a section of the 500-yard channel. The only communication was the occasional tug on a guide rope, a simple code that conveyed everything from position set to all clear. Then a sound, sharp and unnatural, cut through the quiet lapping of the waves, a metallic clink. Every man in the water froze, their bodies rigid with adrenaline. Jack turned his head slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the silhouette of a young frogman, Jonesy, his hand hovering where his detonator pouch should be. The kid's eyes were wide with terror behind his mask. He had dropped it. A live detonator, now lying somewhere on the steel skeleton of a mine pylon below him. A single premature spark could set off a chain reaction, turning their entire team into a red mist. A minute passed. It felt like a lifetime. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle slosh of water against coral. No explosion came, no shouts from the shore. Slowly, cautiously, Jack gave the signal to resume. The men moved with even greater care now, their earlier tension magnified into a near unbearable state of hyper-awareness. The incident had shaken them, a stark reminder of how thin the line was between success and catastrophic failure. As they worked, Finn suddenly jabbed a finger past Jack's shoulder. Jack turned to see a sea snake, thick as a man's arm and banded in black and white, slither past his face, its movements fluid and indifferent. It disappeared into the gloom as quickly as it had appeared. After it passed, Jack grabbed Finn's arm, his grip tight. "Focus, Finn," he whispered, the word a puff of bubbles in the water. "The only snakes we're worried about tonight carry rifles." They finished their section, linking the waterproof primacord fuses into a single continuous line that snaked back towards the deep water where the detonator team waited. The job was done. At dawn, huddled on the deck of the Galloway, wrapped in coarse wool blankets and shivering uncontrollably, they watched. The command went out. Far out on the water, a single massive plume of white water, fire, and debris erupted into the sky. It was followed by a deep, gut-punching roar that rolled across the ocean. A clean, perfect channel had been blasted through the heart of the Japanese defenses. A spontaneous cheer went up from the hundreds of Marines lining the rails of the nearby transports, a raw, guttural sound of approval. But for Jack's team, the victory was hollow, tainted by loss. During the frantic paddleback, a burst of random machine gun fire from a nervous sentry on the shore had stitched across one of the rafts. They had lost a man, a boy from Ohio named Miller, whose empty space on the deck was a gaping wound in their small fraternity. Jack's face was a grim, unreadable mask. He had solved his deadly math problem, but the cost was already higher than he had ever wanted to calculate. Miles away, in a concrete command bunker dug into the hills overlooking the beach, Colonel Kenji Tanaka was jolted awake by the tremor of the earth. An intelligent, proud officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, he had personally overseen the design and placement of the Saipan beach defenses. He considered them a work of art, an impenetrable barrier that would bleed the American invaders dry in the surf. He rushed from his bunker, his aides struggling to keep pace, and ran to a lookout point. What he saw made him stop dead. His beautiful, deadly garden was gone. A 500-yard gap had been torn through its center, a perfect, inviting highway leading directly to his beaches. He was stunned. Then a cold, calculated fury began to burn in his chest. His subordinates, when questioned, had no explanation. There had been no preliminary naval bombardment, no aircraft, no sign of any attack. It was as if ghosts had come in the night and dismantled his masterpiece. He stared at the churning water, at the impossible channel, and a deep sense of professional shame washed over him. He had been outmaneuvered, humiliated. He vowed with a chilling certainty that it would never happen again. Weeks later, the briefing room on the Galloway felt different. The air was still thick with smoke, but the faces of the men were no longer a mixture of bravado and anxiety. They were seasoned, their eyes holding a quiet, haunted look. They had seen the cost of their work, and it had changed them. The intelligence officer was back, but this time, the name of their unseen adversary was known. "Colonel Kenji Tanaka," the officer said, tapping a photograph of a stern-faced Japanese officer. He survived Saipan. Imperial Command was so impressed with his defensive designs, despite what you accomplished, that they have made him chief advisor for the shore fortifications on our next target, Guam. He pinned up new reconnaissance photos. The images showed defenses that were far more complex, more insidious. The neat, predictable rows of obstacles were gone, replaced by chaotic, overlapping patterns. Tanaka has adapted, the officer continued, his voice grim. He's no longer just defending against landing craft. He's hunting you. He pointed to faint lines visible just beneath the surf. Tripwires. Our analysts believe they're connected to underwater grenades. He's also established listening posts on coral outcrops, specifically to detect swimmers. He paused, letting the information sink in. He has designed a defense made specifically to kill frogmen. He's expecting you. A low murmur went through the room. This was no longer a simple demolition job. It was a personal duel. To make matters worse, the officer added, gesturing to a weather chart, a storm is brewing. It's expected to hit the island the night of the operation. Command is unwilling to delay the invasion schedule. The mission is a go, despite the weather. Later, Jack gathered his men. He looked at their faces, harder now, but still so young. They're hunting us now, he said, his voice low and steady. That means we have to be smarter, quieter. More perfect than we were on Saipan. We stick to the training, no mistakes. We do this for Miller. He saw them nod, their jaws tight. The name of their fallen comrade was a sacrament, a promise. Jack spent the next hours poring over the maps of Guam, trying to get inside Tanaka's mind, trying to anticipate the geometry of his traps, to think like the man who was now his personal enemy. The sea off Guam was a churning cauldron of violence. The storm had hit with its full tropical fury, turning the night into a disorienting nightmare of driving rain and powerful crashing waves. Visibility was near zero. The rafts were tossed about like toys, and the moment the men hit the water, they were scattered. Jack fought to keep his partner in sight, a frantic, desperate struggle against the current and the swell. He lost sight of Finn's group almost immediately, their dim shapes swallowed by the rain and the black water. Communication was impossible. The roar of the storm was a physical force, drowning out all sound. Jack was faced with a terrible choice: abort the mission and doom the landing, or trust that his men, scattered and alone in the chaos, would remember their training and complete their sections independently. He made his choice. He had to trust them. He and his partner, a tough sailor named Kowalski, fought their way towards the shore. Every wave was a battering ram, threatening to smash them against the unseen coral heads. As they navigated a dense field of obstacles, Kowalski's leg snagged. He let out a muffled cry of pain and terror. Jack saw it instantly, a thin, almost invisible wire wrapped around his partner's ankle. Pulled taut, a tripwire. Jack's blood ran cold. He didn't hesitate. He surged forward, pulling his kabar knife. His fingers, clumsy with cold, found the wire. He sawed at it with frantic desperation, the serrated edge biting into the thin steel. The wire snapped just as another wave crashed over them, the motion that would have pulled the pin on a grenade. They were safe, for now. Despite the chaos, the team's brutal training held. In scattered pairs, fighting the current, the waves, and the ever-present fear, they planted their charges. They worked by instinct, their movements a testament to endless repetition, their minds focused on the single vital task. Miraculously, as the extraction time neared, they began to find each other in the churning darkness, drawn together by some unseen bond of shared trauma and purpose. They made it back to the rafts, battered, bruised, and utterly exhausted. But they made it. Back on the Galloway, as they were pulled from the water, they learned the incredible news. Every man was accounted for. They had done it. They had beaten the storm, and they had beaten Tanaka. This time, there were no cheers from the Marines, only a quiet, profound respect from the officers who understood the hell they had just endured. They had won again, but as Jack stood on the deck, the rumble of the distant battle for Guam already beginning, he knew this was an escalation. Tanaka would learn from this too. The next time would be even harder, even more deadly. A few days later, he heard the ship's officers speaking in hushed, fearful tones of their next objective, a name that sounded like a death sentence, a place of black volcanic sand and unparalleled defenses. Iwo Jima. The final briefing for Iwo Jima was not held in the smoky, cramped room of the previous missions. It was in the Admiral's own flag plot, a space that smelled of polished wood and clean charts. The upgrade in venue did nothing to ease the tension. It only amplified it. The grainy photographs pinned to the wall were terrifying. They showed a landscape of black volcanic sand, a desolate alien shore, offering no cover, no concealment, nothing but a perfect field of fire for the defenders dug into the hellish rock of the island itself. The intelligence officer's pointer was steady, but his voice carried a new, graver tone. "Gentlemen, this is the fortress. Iwo Jima is, without exaggeration, the most heavily fortified island in the world. And the man in charge of its shore sector is our old friend, Colonel Kenji Tanaka." A grim silence fell over the room. Jack felt a cold knot form in his gut. This was the final act of their deadly play. "He has spent months preparing for us," the officer continued. "He knows we are coming, and he knows how we operate. The horned scullies and concrete pyramids are there, but they are merely the outer layer. Intelligence gathered from submarine reconnaissance and decrypted communications has revealed his true masterpiece." He pointed to a diagram, a complex schematic of lines and nodes that looked like a circuit board. "Tanaka has created a network. The mines are no longer simple, independent triggers. They are linked by thousands of yards of subsurface command wires, all leading back to hidden, reinforced pillboxes on the high ground. Tripping a wire won't set off a mine. It will simply send a signal, a tiny light on a board, alerting a watcher. That watcher can then choose which section of the grid to detonate electronically. He can wait until your entire team is in the kill zone. He has built a defense not to stop boats, but to slaughter frogmen." The room was utterly still. The ingenuity of it was as terrifying as its lethality. Tanaka had turned the entire surf zone into a remotely operated weapon. An admiral's aide, a young man with old eyes, stepped forward. "The brass is calling this a reconnaissance in force. We all know what it is. The 5th Marine Division cannot land on that beach without a cleared channel. There is no alternative. You find a way through, Lieutenant, or this entire invasion fails on day 1, and thousands of men will die for nothing." Later, on the fantail, Finn stood beside Jack, staring out at the endless gray expanse of the Pacific. The reckless grin was long gone, replaced by a grim tightness around his mouth. "A web," Finn said, his voice a low rasp. "The bastard built a spider's web for us." Jack watched the horizon, his mind already working, dissecting the problem, searching for the flaw in the design. He was an engineer. Tanaka was an engineer. This was their final personal duel, to be fought with wires and explosives in the dark. "Then we'll have to cut the strands," Jack said, his voice quiet but firm, "before the spider knows we're there." The water off Iwo Jima was unnervingly calm, the black sand of the seabed seeming to suck all light from the sliver of moon above. The silence was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that was far more unnerving than the raging storm they had faced on Guam. Jack and his team swam with a slow, deliberate grace, ghosts in a dead world. It didn't take them long to find the wires. They were thin, almost invisible against the dark, gritty bottom, a spider's silk of deadly intent. Jack's plan was as simple as it was dangerous. They had to sever the command wires that led back to the shore, before they could even think about placing their own charges. It was the equivalent of performing brain surgery in the dark, underwater, with the patient's brain rigged to explode. Each man carried a set of insulated wire cutters and a roll of electrical tape. They worked in pairs, tracing the delicate wires through the sand, snipping them, and carefully taping the ends to prevent any accidental signal. Their nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Every scrape of a fin on a rock, every muffled thump of their own heartbeats in their ears was a potential death sentence. Jack moved with a focused intensity, his engineer's mind visualizing the complex network, seeing the flow of potential electricity, the path of the signal he had to interrupt. He was in his element, a world of pure mechanics and logic, yet he had never felt so close to the edge. He was working on a junction box, a small metal node where several wires converged, when he felt 5 sharp tugs on his guide rope. The emergency signal. He turned to see Finn, about 20 feet away, frozen in place. His ankle was tangled in a mess of wires. He wasn't struggling. He knew better. Any movement, any change in tension could be the one that alerted the watcher in the pillbox. Jack swam to him, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He signaled for Finn to remain absolutely still. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. He followed the wire from Finn's ankle, not to a mine, but to a small, unfamiliar device half buried in the sand. It wasn't a trigger. It was an alarm. A pressure-sensitive plate. Tanaka's genius was diabolical. He had anticipated they might try to cut the wires, so he'd booby-trapped the network itself. The pressure of Finn's ankle on the wire had likely already closed a circuit. The only thing keeping them alive was a secondary mechanism, a delay, or a final trigger that required a more significant pull. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't cut the wire. He had to disarm the alarm itself. He pulled his kabar, its familiar weight a small comfort. Using the tip of the blade as a surgical tool, he carefully scraped away the sand from the device. His fingers, guided only by touch and his intrinsic understanding of mechanical things, found the seams of a small casing. He worked it open, revealing a delicate clockwork of springs and contacts. It was a masterpiece of deadly simplicity. A slight increase in tension would pull a lever, allowing 2 contacts to touch. He saw it, a tiny gap, no wider than a human hair, separating them. He had to disable it without closing that gap. Holding his breath until his lungs burned, he used the point of his knife to gently, painstakingly bend one of the contacts away. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then he felt a faint release of tension in the wire. He had done it. He carefully untangled the wire from Finn's ankle and gave him the signal. All clear. They continued their work, their nerves shredded, the silence of the sea now filled with the phantom ticking of 100 invisible clocks. They were placing the last of their own charges, their canvas bags nearly empty, when the world turned white. A flare, fired from a pillbox on the ridge, burst directly overhead, casting the entire surf zone in a terrifying, ghostly light. They were caught, exposed. For a frozen moment, Jack saw dozens of Japanese soldiers on the beach turning their heads, their rifles beginning to rise. Then the night erupted. Machine guns opened up from hidden bunkers, their tracers drawing fiery lines across the water. The surface of the sea around them was churned into a frenzy. Geysers of water erupting as bullets ripped through it. Chaos descended. The silent, methodical mission became a frantic scramble for survival. Men dove for the scant cover of the obstacles they had just wired for destruction. Jack's mind worked with a cold, terrifying clarity. They were caught between finishing the job and escaping with their lives. They couldn't do both. He had to make a choice. He found the guide rope for the team furthest to the south, the one closest to the heaviest concentration of fire. He gave a series of sharp, frantic tugs, the signal they had rehearsed for just this contingency. Detonate now. He felt a pang of agony. He was ordering those men to set off their charges while they were still in the water, to use their own explosion as a diversion. It was a death sentence, but it was the only way. A moment later, a huge section of the beach defenses erupted in a titanic blast of fire and water. The explosion was immense, far larger than the one on Saipan, and it served its purpose. The Japanese gunners, stunned by the blast and assuming it was the main attack, shifted their fire towards the source of the explosion. Under the cover of the deafening roar and the ensuing confusion, Jack screamed into the water, the sound a useless garble of bubbles. "Go! Go now!" He frantically connected the last of his own fuses to the main line, his fingers clumsy and slick with a mixture of seawater and cold sweat. He and the rest of the team began their desperate swim back towards the extraction point, bullets zipping past them like angry hornets, the water glowing with the eerie light of the tracers. Every stroke was a prayer. Every kick a desperate gamble against a fiery death. They were pulled from the black water onto the rubber rafts, wounded, bleeding, and utterly spent. Jack did a frantic head count. 2 men were missing, lost in the chaos of the diversionary explosion. The cost of his decision was a fresh, gaping wound in his soul. As the raft sped towards the dark shape of the Galloway, the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of blood and gold. And then, as if on cue, the main detonation went off. It was not one explosion, but a perfect, synchronized chain reaction. Along 500 yards of beach, Tanaka's web of death was ripped apart in a single cataclysmic wall of fire. The black sand was thrown high into the air, and the sea boiled. Soon after, the first wave of landing craft appeared, their engines roaring, their ramps poised. They sped towards the shore, straight into the channel the Frogmen had created. The invasion of Iwo Jima had begun. On a volcanic ridge overlooking the landing beaches, Colonel Kenji Tanaka stood with his binoculars pressed to his eyes. He watched in stunned, silent disbelief as the American landing craft poured onto his beach through a perfectly cleared, unobstructed path. His web, his masterpiece of defensive engineering, was broken. His traps were useless. He saw the secondary explosions as a few of the landing craft strayed from the channel and triggered the mines the Frogmen had missed, and in that moment he understood the totality of his defeat. Without that cleared channel, the entire first wave would have been annihilated. He had not been beaten by battleships or bombers or a frontal assault. He had been beaten by a handful of swimmers in the night. It was the ultimate, most professionally humiliating defeat of his life. He slowly lowered his binoculars, his face a mask of cold, profound shame. The ghosts had come for him, and they had won. On the deck of the Galloway, Finn, a crude bandage wrapped around his arm, stood next to Jack. They watched the tiny figures of the Marines hitting the beach, fanning out, moving inland. The sounds of the battle, a terrible symphony of gunfire and explosions, drifted back to them across the water. "Look at 'em go," Finn said, his voice hoarse. "We did that, Jackie. We did that." Jack watched the landing craft, his face an unreadable mixture of pride and sorrow. He thought of the 2 men they had lost, their faces now joining Miller's in the gallery of ghosts he carried in his mind. "Yeah, Finn," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We did." A few days later, the surviving members of Jack's team sat together in the ship's mess hall. The distant, constant rumble of the battle for Iwo Jima was the new background noise of their lives. They ate in a shared silence, the easy camaraderie of the early days replaced by a somber, profound understanding of what they had endured. They were no longer the cocky, anxious boys who had boarded the Galloway months ago. They were veterans, their youth burned away in the cold fire of the Pacific surf. A high-ranking Marine officer, his uniform stained with the grime of the front lines, entered the mess. He walked directly to their table. The men tensed, Unsure of what to expect, the officer looked at their faces, one by one. "I just came from the beach," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "We've started interrogating the first wave of prisoners. We found Colonel Tanaka's command bunker. We found his charts, his plans." He shook his head in disbelief. "We had no idea what you men swam into. The analysts estimate that without that channel you cleared, we would have lost the first 3 waves, maybe 5,000 men. The entire landing would have failed." He looked at Jack, his eyes filled with a raw, unvarnished gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. He then turned and walked away, leaving the men in an awkward silence. They didn't celebrate. The praise felt foreign, disconnected from the gritty, terrifying reality of what they had done. Their victory was invisible to the world, a secret known only to them, to the men whose lives they had saved, and to the enemy who had so fatally underestimated them. Jack looked at the faces of his men, his brothers, forged in the crucible of the sea. They were the ghosts of the surf, the silent architects of the invasion's first, most crucial victory. Their work was done, but their legacy, a new form of warfare born in the dark waters of the Pacific, was just beginning. It was a legacy of impossible courage, of quiet sacrifice, a foundation of grit and ingenuity upon which the legends of the future Navy SEALs would be built.